In this presentation, we will take a look at non-statistical sampling for tests of controls, recalling that in prior presentations we noted we can use statistical or non-statistical sampling methods, and then we went through some of the methods for statistical sampling, a more formalized method that will be using statistics for the testing of controls. Non-statistical sampling, not using some of those statistical methods, having pros and cons, however, including possibly being able to go through some set formats as opposed to the mathematical statistical samples for each item, which could be a little bit easier to do. Some of the cons might be that we end up with basically larger sample sizes, possibly, given these conventions might be erring on the larger size of things. So we could end up doing more testing, but spending less time on some of the rigors of the statistics for the statistical sampling. So here, non-statistical sampling. Decide on the sample size. That's the first thing we're going to do. Decide the sample size when we're applying the non-statistical sampling. Same kind of theory we have here. We've got a sample. Our example is that we have some purchase documents. We're trying to see if they are in compliance with the control of, saying, a verification process, which we're going to see if there's initials on the documentation that would relate to that particular control. So if that is then the case, we're going to decide what's going to be the sample size. The entire population would be all of those purchasing documents. We want to then decide what will the sample size be, how many of them do we need to test. Auditing firm may have a non-statistical sampling policy giving general guidelines as to the sample size. So we might have this in basically a checklist or some kind of non-statistical policy that we might have that could actually be easier for us to use. So that, for example, if control reliance is low, the firm may choose 15. That might be basically the policy. If moderate, the sample size might be 25, and if high, the sample size might be 50. So we might have basically a set of rules that we're going to basically have and apply to consider what the full sample size would be. We might just basically have a grid that would show us sample size, the total population, and then give us basically the sample size that we would take from that in our non-statistical type of sampling method. A benefit of this kind of non-statistical sampling is that it promotes consistency in sampling applications. So this actually has a benefit in that although it's not statistical, we're not doing a statistical calculation and being as precise in terms of the statistical calculation, it will be more consistent in that we're just basically going to take this conventional rule, look at the chart, and basically apply the sample sizes in accordance with the set of rules that have been set up. Sample items selection. So now that we have the sample size, how do we select those items? In our case, the purchasing documents. How do we go in and pick which ones we're going to be using within our testing? Non-statistical sampling allows the use of random or systematic selection. So we can apply, again, the thing that we would most think about, the random basically selection. However, it also permits the use of other methods such as haphazard sampling. When haphazard sampling selection is used, sampling units are selected without any bias, in other words, without a special reason for including or omitting items from the sample. Upper deviation rate calculation. With a non-statistical sample, the auditor can calculate the sample deviation rate. However, they cannot mathematically quantify the upper deviation rate computed and sampling risk associated with the tests.